Over the next 3 episodes of MOE in Conversation, I'll be joined by filmmaker Nicky Gogan. Nicky is a graduate of the National College of Art and Design and the European Audiovisual Entrepreneurs. Nicky has spearheaded numerous cultural events and organisations over the years, including Sync Digital Media, Darklight Film Festival, Data, Wildlight Channel, exhibit series at the Digital Hub, offline animation residency, and still films, where Nicky has been writing, producing, editing and directing animations, artist films, dramas and documentaries over the past 15 years. Nicky's work at Still Films continues its roots in documentary, where she most recently produced Vivian Dick's film New York, Our Time. Her work has won numerous prestigious awards, and she is a creative force to be reckoned with a unique perspective. Last Hijack won an Emmy Award for Best Online Production in Non-Fiction category in 2015. Nicky was nominated for Multimedia Person of the Year by the Digital Media Awards in 2003 and 2004. Still Films won the Dublin Critics Circle Michael Dwyer Discovery Award for New Talent in 2011 at the Dublin International Film Festival for Build Something Modern, which was also voted one of the top 5 Irish films of 2011 by the Irish Times. Seaview received a special jury's mention at the DMZ Docs in Korea, and Pajama Girls won the Audience Award at the Capital Irish Film Festival in Washington, D.C. Over the next 3 episodes, we're going to focus on a trilogy of documentaries: Seaview, Build Something Modern, and Pajama Girls. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Nicky Gogan about Build Something Modern, a documentary made about a group of Irish architects whose modernist designs for hospitals, schools and churches were commissioned by Catholic missionaries in Africa from the 1940s onwards.
Our first night in Uganda was a revelation. Instead of the slow descent from twilight that we were used to, the day seemed to crash violently into darkness. The equatorial 12-hour day and 12-hour night would now be, for us, the unchanging norm. The bus station was the only significant building being built in Dublin at the time, and it was almost finished. But anything else we designed usually remained on paper, just nice pretty drawings. Nothing was being built. And that was very frustrating for young architects. We wanted to build. We wanted to see buildings actually rising out of the ground. There's a sense, I suppose, of power in a way of a young architect to walk onto your building site and see what you've just done on paper coming up as a 3-dimensional building. Emigrating was the only solution. And for me, of course, I also wanted to emigrate for adventure. I wanted to climb mountains as well as build buildings. And that was a search. The search really went on in those days for somewhere interesting to go. Somewhere would have the opportunity to build modern buildings, particularly modern buildings. I wasn't interested in building, in those days actually, I was a mainline card-carrying modernist. I wanted a young modern firm that would build modern architecture, and I got that eventually from a firm in Kampala. Kampala really was a new city, so it really didn't matter what you did. There was a colonial government, independence was still a few years away. It was great from the creative point of view that you were designing everything, everything was new. The main influence in the 1950s was the Corbusier. Le Corbusier's Chandigarh in India, which excited all of us. We thought we were great.
One of the first things that I had to learn was that there was a huge change in how they understood what time meant. I had to get into a new mode of thinking that time to the African was a much slower thing than it was here at home. I became sort of attuned to their very, very nice way of living. Nothing is in a hurry. Don't worry if it doesn't come tomorrow. You know, life will take care of it.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Museum of Everyone. I'm joined again by film producer and director Nicky Gogan, among other things. And we are following on, I suppose, from our initial conversation about, referencing Seaview and our discussion on that last week, to I suppose what you could call the second piece of a trilogy, really. And this piece is called Build Something Modern. Nicky, can you tell us a little bit, first of all, about how this film came about? First of all, just to give you kind of a brief outline, it's really essentially about Irish architects being commissioned by Catholic missionaries to build churches and schools and hospitals in Africa during the 60s. And these designs are generally extraordinarily modernist. And quite ambitious, I suppose, from an architectural point of view, maybe buildings that might not have been built in Ireland at the time or would have been given permission. I know that some of the research came from Dr. Lisa Godson. And can you tell us a little bit about how you started with that, and then how this, like, you know, moved into something else?
Yeah, so it's kind of, it's sort of it came from a conversation with Lisa, and we were thinking about maybe trying to do a project together as well. And she told me that she'd been told about this genre of architecture basically by Pierce McKenna's son, who was a friend of her husband's, who also works in architecture, and that they found some photos and some slides of the work that Pierce's company had done in Africa during the 60s, 50s, even late 50s and 60s, which were just unbelievable, because I knew that Lisa was very preoccupied, and a lot of her work is to do with design, ecclesiastical design as well, the everyday, you know, and that they were like, these photos of these buildings are incredible, like, you know. So myself and Lisa went and called in to the McKennas and saw from the attic this box of slides, and we were just like, you know, we were like, what? And it was like basically like spaceships had landed in the jungle in you know, Kenya or something, you know. These unbelievable church designs, these really, really complex and modern as well, and much more modern than, you know, there's a handful of real modernist buildings in Ireland, as we know. You know, so these are like really extraordinary, and we were just like, this is so cool. You know, we need to find out more about this, and then essentially we basically applied to the Irish Arts Council, the Real Arts Scheme, which is about they commissioned 2 or 3 documentaries a year about different kinds of disciplines, and then we applied at Lisa. And these few pictures that we found and slides and stuff, and then they gave us the budget to go make the film. And then, yes, that was kind of it, really. Like, so quite a far compared to Seaview, like just the opposite, like a really quick kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it was a hidden history and nobody had written about this or made any documented it in any way, was such an amazing journey then that we took with Lisa, which was to unearth the architects that designed these buildings, the priests that build the buildings. I mean, I'm sure we'll get onto that. Yeah, you know? Yeah. The fact that it was just this huge wealth of modernist design made in Ireland, which people didn't know about because the buildings weren't in the country, you know.
And in some cases, even some of these designs were made, and the architects who designed them didn't even realise that they had been this until years.
Absolutely, yeah. Like, because they would have been like students or graduates are coming into these firms and stuff, and then kind of been given sort of free reign, you know, because this is all pro bono work, you know, for the church.
This is very much a film, I suppose, about you know, this kind of history. I know that it's certainly, we're looking at, I suppose, between 1940 up to 1970-ish. A lot of it really is takes place, I suppose, from 1960s on. There's kind of concentrated kind of time there, where Africa had really just kind of gained its independence. And then we have this kind of cohort of, you know, Catholic missionaries and these architects. You know, essentially, you know, these are our main characters within this documentary, who are kind of redesigning this new kind of, you know, these kind of colonial architecture, albeit very modernist, and albeit what we would deem from a Western perspective at that point as progressive. But it is problematic as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I guess that looking at the kind of the time frame, so these African nations were being liberated from colonialism one by one, and what was kind of straddling this was the kind of infiltration of Christianity and, you know, Catholic churches, who we're dealing with in the documentary too. Yeah, so I suppose it's trying to bring the European bricks and mortar kind of style of building buildings to countries where, you know, that wasn't necessarily the best way to build a building, or the most suitable or useful or you know, what's the word? Effective way to build a building, you know. So they're trying to enforce these, you know, how can we design bricks which let the breeze through, you know, maybe don't use bricks. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of, you know, there's that kind of stuff going on, which is kind of playful in the film, I suppose, as well. And that book, Tropical Architecture, that we kind of quote from a good bit, and the discussion that would be on the early side, the discussion of who the people were going to be inhabiting these buildings in a very oddly objective way is kind of unusual too. And we, you know, there's passages in the film where we have Solomon Osho, who's also in Seaview, he's rapping in Seaview, read from this book about how we can design buildings, you know, with our European sensibility intact, but we'll also work in the tropics, you know.
When the colonizing nations of Europe first entered the tropics, they brought with them the architecture that they practiced at home. They brought with them whatever architecture they had. So, when immediately after the war, we went to West Africa, what did we take with us? Certainly not the traditional architecture. Instead of that, we took a kind of apparatus of thought, of puzzling out the problems of architecture from the beginning, in a kind of logical way, but with feeling.
A lot of these churches were commissioned by these Catholic missionaries, who these architects in Ireland would design them. Some of them would actually make the journey. Some of them maybe not.
Bigger names made it over, small ones wouldn't,
But even with regards to the missionaries themselves, they had a tagline which was "Join the Holy Ghost Fathers and see the world." Yeah. You know, so there's that in the spirit of that. It was this kind of almost this kind of colonial level of kind of, we're discovering these places and we are kind of making I suppose flying this kind of alternate flag there, which is what these monuments are. But also it was extraordinarily forward thinking to a massive extent from an architectural perspective. And balancing those things in the documentary, I thought must have been quite difficult.
Yeah, you know, obviously there's a lot of, you know, baggage comes along with the Catholic Church in Ireland, and certainly in the countries in Africa that they were present in as well, you know, and all the stuff that's going on with the mother and baby homes and everything like that. So that's all there, you know, it's not in the film, but it's there in when we start talking about priests and interviewing priests of a certain age and stuff. We're going, okay, they might have been part of that whole thing. But we tried not to, like with our other films, not to bring any judgment on this. We really wanted to hear about the stories with empathy and with interest, you know. And I think that's something it's particular, I think, to the missions as well, that a lot of the priests that would have gone over to missions would have gone really young, and it was an adventure. It was like, okay, you know, it was one of the most exciting careers you could probably do in Ireland, certainly in the 1960s and 50s, you know. And they would have been only 18 or 19 going over, and would have spent their lives until they were in their late 80s and 90s. And that's when we meet them. So we're interviewing these men who are at that age, coming at the end of their life, who've actually only ever known their lives in Africa and have been there for their entire lives, but then are kind of shipped back to the seminaries, which really feel like retirement homes now. And we filmed in Spiritons and then in Kiltegan as well. And yeah, it's, so their lives are fascinating. Like at the very end of the film, you see Father Longworth, and he's shown me. I just filmed it on my phone because I didn't know he was going to show me this. And then he actually said he passed away while we were making the film. But he's shown me his tribal clothes, his chief's clothes, which he had been given and stuff, you know. And as well, at one point, I think I mentioned, sorry, but my uncle's interviewed in it too. He was Holy Ghost Father, and then a chap called Spiritons as well. He talks about himself in terms of our tribe, you know, we were the Kikuyu, you know, he's talking about flying provisions in during the Biafran War, you know, to feed the people who didn't have any food across the border and stuff. But yeah,
it was a period where they were airdropped for
yeah. So I remember that. You're probably a bit young. I do remember that was very early, the first kind of images of, you know, Biafran kids and starving children and on the TV and stuff, like when I was small. But that's what he's talking about. Yeah. So so we're trying to, it's a human's experience, you know. They built communities. They thought that they were like the staff in Mosney, you know, even though people were having maybe a more horrific time than they realized, you know, but they, you know, were doing good, you know, and there to do good, you know. So I suppose that's for the most part, I think, you know. And yeah, but yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic between what people in Mosney talked about and how the church affected them and their lives and their relationships with Ireland, you know. And then on the other side, then meeting priests at the end of their lives who had spent their entire lives living in Nigeria and Kenya and other countries, you know, and Sierra Leone. Yeah, and I think as well, there's no kind of judgment. I don't know. It's different subject, but we try to come to it with a very open mind and make it.
Yeah, and I absolutely think that you managed to achieve it. I mean, for something that also is again kind of this kind of idea of this kind of blind spot as well. Like, you know, that like, you know, with regards to the, you know, the history of architecture in Ireland and also in Africa, and that, you know, that this narrative certainly brings that together. So yeah. I think in one of those animated little sections as well, from tropical architecture, it's referenced that, you know, the concrete expands and contracts as a building material because of the sun. And so too do the people expand and contract, and it can cause cracks in both the concrete and in their skin, which can lead to infection. So there's this kind of analogies kind of made as well with regards to, you know, the individuals who might be inhabiting these or who might be utilizing these spaces collectively, and the buildings themselves.
The climate of West Africa is part of the climate of a broadband which stretches right around the world. It includes all the tropical countries lying between 10 degrees minus or plus of the equator, and the same conditions, roughly speaking, apply. You have two major problems to deal with, and the first is the sun. You're very near the equator. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and travels nearly vertically across the heavens. And only in the equinox does it shine onto a north face of a building. And the sun is very fierce. It destroys many materials. Concrete, it expands and contracts too quickly. It has this effect on the people too. It expands and contracts them far too much. It makes evil worms that go into them, and mosquitoes that give them diseases. And so people have got to be considered along with the rest.
There's a level of the micro macro here as well, where we're kind of zoomed into these very keen details, and then we're sometimes brought back out into these grandiose architectural structures. Or how did you kind of go about, you know, looking at those nuances and then, you know, bringing us back out again, because of that refocus?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, no, we definitely because ultimately it's a film about architecture. This is kind of what the commission was. So this is a commissioned film, to remember as well. Like, so, you know, we did have to keep the you know, the draw to go off on a tangent about, you know, more human stories from back then, of people who might have, you know, lived in the villages where some of these churches were built, was always very strong. But we had to, you know, kind of rewind back. So in a way, even though we're saying we weren't kind of obviously in a judging, but we definitely used that book and the juxtaposition of Solomon, who had been a refugee in Ireland, who's now got asylum, using his voice to get into those details, talking about the people and their skin cracking. And there's another quote where they talk, where the words in the book are, you know, we had to treat the inhabitants of these buildings like people with feelings, you know, and you're like,
yeah.
As in you had to say that, you know, do you know what I mean? Because there's that kind of thing coming from slavery and stuff, where people with black skin are somehow not as equal to people with white skin in a real basic way. So we did, in those little details, in juxtaposing these things, we just kind of picked at that a little bit, just to kind of go, look, here, this is the attitude when this was happening, you know. Yeah. So then in terms of the scale thing, yeah, I mean, part of it was because we had got so much amazing material, like all those drawings and stuff, and then the footage of the guys had filmed on their own Super 8 cameras and stuff like that their families gave us, like you know, Sean Rotherby and Miss Hurley, and you know, they had and then Jerry Fry as well, his daughter came to us quite late in the day and said, oh, I found this DVD. We're like, what? You know, so we kind of had, you know, amazing that they were privileged people going over when they did get to go over with them. Had cameras and stuff
at that time as well, to have that
yeah. So we tried to build, so the animations were a way to kind of get into the beautiful drawings, and each architect had their own sort of trees that they drew. Do you know what I mean? Like beautiful hand drawn. I mean, the drawings back then, no clip art, you know, back then, like gorgeous like renditions of how they would draw plants and stuff, and then come back to the building. So we kind of wanted to sort of show the creative process. There was the thought process of how you design a brick to be able to have ventilation, yet keep the rain out. How does that work? To the drawings of the artist sitting there in Ireland with the drawing boards, doing this with a pen and a blade to scratch off the ink when you make a mistake, you know, back to then. And then actually seeing the buildings being constructed in one or two cases on film, and then finally seeing them as they are now at the end. You see the kind of the techno part of the film, are flipping through all these really fast shots of the buildings as they are now, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was like that. It's just we like that kind of detail, I suppose. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I think that letting the viewer kind of be privy to those things, and again, this kind of very kind of rhythmical editing, and that the consciousness of that, I think, is really great, and propels this narrative too.
Yeah.
We might talk about
animation as well. I mean, obviously using animation, and it's something that we do a lot, and I still work in that area. But you know, actually, for that, it's perfect.
We had to find somebody who would be in charge of the site, because I was only going to be there once every 3 months or once every 4 months. I would go out, stay a month, and then I would come home. We had a foreman who was a Kikuyu genius, and without Stephen Wanyohi, I don't think it would ever have happened. He was just one of these natural people who had a gift for building. It was a complicated building. It was daring. The concept was new. It required a whole new dimension of how to put things together, and Stephen was the man. We had one little concrete mixer, one, and when that broke down, and it did, there were no spare parts in Eldoret. They would have to go to Nairobi, get the spare parts, bring them back up, and put them back in the concrete mixer would start rolling again. There was a problem about where the cathedral was going to be built. I gave instructions to Anyohi to clear what I called the kitchen maze garden. And he asked the driver to do this, and he said, no, I won't. Oh, he said, the kitchen maze garden, he said, that has been planted with seed, and that will grow and will be harvested next September. And nobody can touch that, because that belongs to the people. That little piece of land was going to produce maize, which was going to produce bread for people, for a dozen or so families for 3 months. And they would not, under any circumstance, go in on that land. And this was a continuous part of the enculturation of a Western architect into African society.
We have to talk about some of these buildings from, you know, the idea that, you know, there was just a conversation basically between was it Gerald Fry?
Yeah.
And he said, I have 50,000 concrete blocks to make a building. What can you design for me?
Yeah.
And that was the starting point for this church to be built.
Yeah.
So these are the kind of negotiations and these are the kind of sparks that led to these buildings. Like some of them are very, very kind of rudimentary beginnings, but ultimately they become these quite dramatic, you know, erections on the landscape.
Jerry didn't build a rectangle, he built a 12-sided, whatever kind of like church with like spiky, you know, roofs. And it was just, I mean, and then sent it over to Jim Sharkey, who was like, which way down does the roof go, basically, right? You know, and proceeded to spend a couple of years building this church from the pile of bricks that he'd been donated, you know. But just you know, and then obviously we talked this before. We met Jerry Fry, and he told us, or Faye, and he told us the story, showed us the photos and whatnot, mentioning Jim Sharkey, and then we went to Kiltegan to meet the priests and stuff, and of course met Father Jim Sharkey, you know, and we got to ask him about that too. So that was one of those. As a filmmaker, you're going, I can't believe we met this guy. And the fact that Jerry had gone, he only ever sent me a photograph, or he didn't send me a photograph for ages. I ran into him then years later and said, you never even sent me a picture of the church. What does it look like? You know?
He didn't even realise that the building had been built.
True, yeah.
And it was Jim Sharkey also. There was that realisation by I think was it Jerry Fay that was over as well, that he said he realised he had no experience at all with regards to building, never mind building a church.
That was Jim, yeah.
There's these kind of, it's this kind of the links in the chain were not necessarily always the strongest, but still the buildings were being turned out, and that's something I just find so kind of fascinating as well, you know.
Still standing for the most part. Maybe not all Benin's churches, but they're still there, a lot of them, you know.
Yeah.
When I was in practice, I did work for the local council, and the chairman at one particular point in time had a brother who was a missionary in Nigeria, as it happened. He was a Holy Ghost father. And the chairman said, I'd like you to meet my brother, and maybe you can design my church. The parish have been making concrete blocks for the past 10, 20 years, and he said they have 50,000 concrete blocks. Could you make a church out of them? So I said, well, I'll try. So I did. When I say I did, I describe it more like a Lego church, because it was remote control. I did a plan and a model, and I sent the model out. And I've got photographs of it, the church here. This is the model, and this is the church I've built. Close resemblance, but the proportions are slightly different. When I think back on it, I wouldn't venture to give a client or anybody else such simple information or a builder and expect them to build. And they did extremely well, considering. But as I say, it was a totally new experience. I sent plans, much more detailed than and didn't hear from him for years. And he was home from the missions, and I said, when I met him, his name was Father Sharkey, I said, Father Jim, whatever happened in church? Oh, he said, it's the most admired in the diocese. Well, I said, you never told me it was built. So he sent me the photographs. I've never actually seen it in the flesh, but I've got the photographs of it.
Looking at the kind of the aesthetic of the film, which again it does, and also your use of audio as well. The soundtrack on this is great. It does obviously reference what we would call, I suppose, the first of this trilogy, which is Sea View. In Build Something Modern, you have a lot of these kind of very kind of split screen visuals with these kind of multi-layered archival video pieces, and sometimes stills as well, creating its own architecture within the screen as well, but bringing us very much on a journey where we can kind of fast forward into certain areas, or it contextualizes the next part of the film for us, which is very important. So again, documentary making is storytelling. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of the decision making, because they are complex little things to make?
Yeah, we do like to do things. I mean, okay, so on a real practical level, we had footage that was 4:3 aspect ratio. How do you deal with that? What do you do? Do you blur the sides? Do you appear the post with black on the sides? We always wanted to bring these lines, these like lines that you're drawing, back to this idea of the draftsman, the drawing, and the architectural practice. So that's why a lot of the white lines come in, in parallel, and we just have the footage scaled up or whatever, and just mirrored sometimes on either side. And for that, we wanted to come up with an aesthetic frame that, spoke to architecture basically. So we did that, and then we kind of had that to play with then. And then so when my Uncle Jerry's talking about flying the plane, this kind of diagonal line during the whole story crosses the screen as he's talking about the planes dropping the food over to Biafra, and underneath that we have then some sound design with planes and whatnot. We got some of the footage then from the Irish Film Archive, which is an incredible resource. Oh my god, it's unbelievable. So all the footage of the kids in school and all that kind of stuff, and then we were kind of wanted to express if things were getting a bit frenetic and stuff in terms of what was happening culturally at the time, and using then those kind of layers to build up those squares of animation and footage and stuff like that again, So it was kind of like, it became from what was originally, I suppose, we need to somehow do this 4:3 footage when the film is 69, like we're going to go, okay, how are we going to do that in a pretty way, to it becoming a very strong visual motif or aspect to the whole film, I mean, I can't really express how much a part of the team Dennis McNulty is to still films, and he's worked on many of our films, certainly the three we're discussing, and he records in all three films, records sounds, and even more so in Pajama Girls, and I'll talk about that later, but like record sounds from the area, creates the music from the sounds from Mosney and from coming on some of the shoots with us for Build Something Modern, and also in Pajama Girls in the flats, the squeaky gates and stuff like that, and then creates music with these. And then we also work with Fiona McCann, who's a sound designer, and she would have then with Build Something Modern, she'd been to Africa and she'd recorded like this field sound, so there's all those insect sounds and all that stuff is all from Africa. She did a tour around a few different countries and stuff like that. So we have this amazing database of sounds, and so her and Dennis, because they worked on a bunch of our films together, would very much complement each other, you know. And Dennis would give us like stems, like loops, and me and Paul would lash in. We'd have a ton. He'd keep emailing us, here's a few more bits of music, and we'd pop them in. While we're editing, as me and Paul co-edit as well, we'd populate the timeline, and then we give it back to Dennis. We'd make it all sound great and mix it properly and finish off the tracks and stuff like that. But we'd have it while we're cutting picture, we're cutting music as well. That's why it's so present and so part of the fabric of the films, I think.
Yeah, and I think sometimes from an editorial perspective that that marriage, especially with some of with sound and with the visuals, one can actually really inform the other, and that you know, the leader of each can swap quite easily too, with regards to how you might edit as well. Yeah, and I think it's certainly there's that wonderful thread of the visual nature of these three films, and that soundscape as well. Yeah. That's very native to, you know, the visuals that we're seeing, but also beautifully and sensitively constructed around kind of the ideas that are being formed.
There were two major influences in approaching the design of the building. One was the general change that had come over the expression of architecture through technology. And secondly, there was the huge change in ritual, in worship, which took place after 1963, which was the Vatican Council. And the priest and people were to be brought together in some symbolic gesture. Now, the symbolism immediately transferred itself into the architecture of the building. The architectural problem is an aesthetic one, and how to raise this concept of domesticity into the realm of art and architecture. And how I approached this was firstly to think of a new fan shape of gathering the people around, so that when you look at the model here, you can see that the building is wedded to the earth horizontally in the African tradition, but the transcendent verticality where these two things cross is where it departs from domesticity and earthiness to a more lofty aspiration through the idea of a tower, so that the people were comfortable at ground level, but they could aspire to something, which was the vertical and the horizontal coming together, from which the light emanates and explodes back into the building, which all comes to rest on one single pole, which is all symbolical, the symbol of unity, which this cathedral is all about.
After Africa had gained its independence, there was a level of kind of tribalism that also kind of rose, and a level of rivalry as well. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the political energies of the time? Because I know we were talking about By Africa, which was like 1967 to 1970-ish then as well. Yeah. So even with regards to kind of the context, just to contextualize a little bit for us as well, because that led to these the medical and food drop-offs as well that your uncle was talking about as well over that period for 3 years actually. That was happening. So again, the kind of the I suppose the political background or the political context at all of that a lot of this footage comes from.
Yeah, so I suppose, we mentioned earlier as well, like, so it would have been the the British and French and Dutch and we're withdrawing, some of the countries remained in the Commonwealth as well, so that would have been still part of it, in the British kind of, even though they weren't kind of ruling, so we're handing over power to local politicians and stuff. And I think that kind of the wealth divide that Claude talks about in Seaview, you know, in Congo, you know, and those kind of, you know, the kind of what the wealth gap or whatever between people who are really had nothing, and then a smaller amount of people kind of managed to do really well out of these transitions, you know. And I think where the priests stepped into the breach of the churches, and it wasn't just Catholic, there was a lot of various different Protestant, Anglican and stuff as well, and in these countries too, but they kind of stepped in, I suppose, didn't they, to kind of fill a gap that was there.
There are over 250 tribes in Nigeria, 6 major tribes, and we were one of the major tribes called the Igbo tribe. After independence, the tribalism kind of reared its head, and there was antagonism between the different tribes. There was a lot of tension in the place. A lot of people had come down from other parts of Nigeria who had lived there for generations. And they came back because they were being persecuted, because they were of that particular tribe. There were soldiers all over the place, taking people out of cars and examining them and looking for guns, looking for this, looking for that. That was 1966, and that's when we started this airlift of food and medicines into Biafra, because Biafra at that time was blockaded by the Nigerians. So the whole area swelled up from 4 million to about 12 million people. And out of that 12 million, 2 million died during Biafra, mostly from malnutrition, from lack of food.
This notion of tribalism, and then, you know, again, this very kind of colonial nature of these churches being kind of erected over this time, and further to be even around these churches for communities to also gather. You know,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You also had tribes donating money. You know, you had these kind of feasts, and you had these, you know, tribes would come and they donate money for these churches to be built, and it would be, you know, it would be seen as something that would bring people together.
I think that's it. I think it was to build community around these churches, you know, and the fact that so Richard Hurley's, I think, is talking about having that big feast, and they did it every year, and each tiny village brought a little bit of something to contribute towards the cathedral, you know, and they had to raise this money to build the cathedral in Nairobi, you know, and it was like just that, I suppose, I don't know, the folks of that or something, I don't know, it was definitely a big community builder. And again, I keep drifting into Seaview because I didn't really talk to people from, you know, Nairobi or Nigeria or whatever we were making Builds New Modern, but it's 2 conversations I had with people from those countries when making Seaview that I know how important the church became in those communities at this time, you know, and it was absolutely, they looked to the church for security and safety and help, and, you know, as I say, to kind of bring the people together again, because they were kind of, you know, boundaries were drawn in terms of the nations, how the kind of borders were drawn were kind of a colonial construct, but obviously in so many tribes in Africa that they kind of carve up the country or the continent in a very different way, you know. So it was that kind of thing, and the fact that I think the church in some way kind of interface with the tribes as well as you know, the countries and stuff. It's kind of, yeah, it's really interesting. And also they went to places like when we were maybe going to go and film the churches ourselves, the ones that were, you know, still standing and stuff, and we couldn't go, like most of them were in parts of, at least as we were going to go to Nigeria, were in parts of Nigeria where there was absolute no-go zone for, you know, European people, white women, you know, it's just far too dangerous. And they were where they went. So they did go to the most, you know, toughest parts of the world, you know, I suppose, to try and bring the word, you know, whether it was, and it seems, you know, as I said, it was, yeah, looking back at it now, you know, it maybe seems like almost like another type of colonization, which it was, but
yeah.
But you know, and most people I've met who are from that part of the world are still very, very religious, you know, and they love that. That's been part of their lives, and having that faith in spiritualism is a huge part of their life.
How were they going to get the money? Nothing like this had ever happened in the diocese before. The idea was that he would have a series of harambees. Now, harambe in Swahili means rowing together. That means getting the idea into the people that they were going to do the rowing, and that there was going to be this beautiful cathedral which would be theirs, and they would build it and they would pay for it. The harambe was an occasion where all the people from all around, all the tribes would come, and you could get up to 2 or 3 or 4 or 5,000 people coming into Eldoret for this celebration. There were a number of these held over a period of 5 years, and everybody brought something. And he had a great big basket, and the name of the village would be called out, and the elder of the village would come up and he would say, "We are donating 20 shillings," and there would be great applause and great cheering, and the 20 shillings would be put into the thing.
Being kind of a post-colonial time, I mean, you know, no matter kind of what happens, I mean, it's you don't wake up without a hangover, basically. I mean, you don't go from, oh, we're suddenly not colonized and everything is fine. I mean, there's obviously, you know, and this, I think, certainly this documentary kind of describes that kind of the very timely nature of this to an extent as well, as almost being some sort of I don't know, some sort of kind of liminal space where all this took place. And on top of the very, very, you know, these very kind of, you know, strange kind of cultural relations that were happening, we also have this architecture being built and being bred out of this. And again, these kind of permissions that wouldn't have been given in Ireland necessarily to build these at that time, but were given there. One of the things I really wanted to touch on as well, and I think it's something that really lit me up, was just some of the visual nature of some of the work and some of the photographs there. I know a piece that's probably one of your favourites too is that beautiful image of the man standing at the altar in the church beside a concrete mixer. With there's a white mother and daughter there then in this particular image then as well. You know, the use of these images over the course of the documentary as well are, you know, it's very kind of cleverly done, but not in a kind of contrived way, but in a way that it kind of constantly reminds us that that, you know, from a Western perspective, we're kind of invading, but there's also the people we're invading to a certain extent are also welcoming this as well. So it's a difficult thing and it's not palatable, but the imagery is just so stunningly, so stunning. There's even that group of young girls young women who are dancing and doing the pirouettes in the tutus as well. I mean, this very kind of Western kind of uniformity, you know, drenching this, you know, by all kinds of really, you know, beautiful, you know, pre-existing society.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot to take in, and the footage from there, and it's like, yeah, because it is, and we do, you know, it was intentional in some way to feel that it was a kind of an invasion, and certainly the pace of some of the editing, and, you know, and the scale, and suddenly towards the end of the film, you realise the amount of buildings that were built. There was like hundreds of these things, you know, and yeah, you're right, intention. But then finding that archive footage of, you know, the girls dancing the tutus and then the Dalmatian running through them, you just go, how is that? You know, it's a stunning piece of footage because it speaks volumes, you know, and it's hard to articulate. You're struggling to articulate why it's so moving, but it's just like this imprint of, you know, European values and aesthetics onto these gorgeous African girls, you know, beautiful, you know, children, you know, and you know, it's just, it's just one of those things, you know. It's kind of moving and sad and beautiful and horrific all at the same time. And there's so much of that in this film, you know. That's the thing again, like as filmmakers, we're not saying this is an abomination, you know, they shouldn't have put, you know, African children in tutus like dancing Swan Lake, you know, back then, you know, but actually, you know, I don't know, you can't judge it like that, you know what I mean? The kids are having a great time.
One of the things I think as well, that if we can draw like a bit of a line between Sea View and between Build Something Modern, is Sea View at the time was obviously a very contemporary film. Build Something Modern then was kind of retrospectively looking at kind of a period of history where that was, you know, previously really not necessarily put in the bracket of a documentary. So this is very much old ground. But because it hadn't been kind of, you know, framed within a documentary, it was very new ground for us. Also from a heritage kind of perspective, and with regards to, you know, it wasn't that it's an important piece of film. But what my question really is, because it's it's a historical film and it's something that happened in the past, it's loaded with all of the things that we've learned from then to now. So it's loaded with 60 years of politics, 60 years of progression and regression and all of these things. So they're two very different, you know, I suppose headspaces and perspectives to take when you're making documentaries.
Yeah, definitely. And it was like in a way we couldn't have made Build Something Modern without having made CV beforehand, you know, because we wouldn't have been able to make those links with having Solomon appear in both films, you know, in a very, I mean, that's very subtle. You don't know that unless you're told that, you know, but hearing a contemporary, you know, Black Irish man's voice read these texts is what we wanted, you know. So, yeah, so I wouldn't have known how, I suppose I would have had a preconceived notion of how people, say, coming from Nigeria to Ireland would have thought about Ireland. I kind of had an idea about what Claude said about the politics side of it, but I didn't ever, until our friend in CV spoke about the priests, I never thought about it like that, you know. And then when the opportunity came around to make a film about that like sort of, as I say, like whatever, 50 years previous, or 40 years previously, what was happening in Africa, to lead to that end thought in Sea View was just such a great opportunity. I
think it's interesting as well that I think certainly Paul's visual arts background really finds a space within this documentary as well, with regards to that creative editing and the rhythm, and again the kind of the beautiful nature of the imagery that's used there as well. So I just want to say, like, a huge thank you for coming along and having a chat about you know, Build Something Modern. And obviously the previous film as well, Sea View. It's so fascinating to talk to you about the process, and also indeed these you know, riveting kind of connections that both of these documentaries have. Yeah. And also next week we'll be talking about the third film in this trilogy, Pajama Girls, which is obviously that little bit closer to home. It's set in Dublin itself, and I can't wait to talk about that. It's a fascinating piece of work, and again, looking at kind of focusing on this very much a blind spot on the landscape of society to an extent, showing us an alternate perspective, which is, you know, what all of these documentaries are tending to do.
Thank you so much. No, I'm delighted, and today it'd be interesting to talk to Pajama Girls in the context of what we just discussed as well, you know. Definitely there's a lot of connections there in terms of what the film is about and is really about, and then also you know, the buildings and their presence, you know, in the film as well, and the connection then that leads back to that's kind of one of the connections with the other two films as well, isn't it? Really, just that kind of like language of architecture and the places we inhabit and how they impact us, you know.
I think it's fascinating as well. I know we're wrapping up, but it's fascinating as well because you know, you had mentioned as well that, you know, with regards to build something modern, I mean it's an all male cast. Pajama Girls is an all female cast living in this very modernist structure, I suppose, as well. So it'll be interesting to elaborate on those as points as well, and yeah, for us to learn a little bit more about the process and your way in. So thank you so much for joining us, Nicky. It's such a pleasure to talk to you, and we look forward to I suppose the third part of our little trilogy here as well.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks a million. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Take care.